Hi, I'm DuEwa Frazier, and you're listening to episode 44 of Nerdacity Podcast. Today, my guest is Joel Diaz Porter, aka DJ Renegade, originally from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and he currently resides in South Jersey. The 1998 and 1999 Haiku Slam champion, he has poems in Poetry, Mead, Best American Poetry 2014, Callaloo, Antioch Review, Red Brick Review, and the anthologies Short Fuse, Roll Call, Def Poetry Jam, 360 Degrees of Black Poetry, Poetry Nation, Beyond the Frontier, and Catch a Fire. Joel is a Canem Fellow who received the 1995 Furious Flower Emerging Poet Award. His collection Ideas of Improvisation has just been released and is published by Thre Makes Blanket Press. I hope you enjoy this episode. Thanks for listening. Wonderful new work. Congratulations on Ideas of Improvisation that was just released in June of this year.
Thank you.
And so, Joel, can we start with one of your wonderful poems from this collection?
Sure. This poem is called Algorithm of the Blues. And among other things, the poem references the life of Charlie Yardbird Parker. And so in doing so, it references a few other poems. One is Canary by Rita Dove, which is actually about Billie Holiday. And then three other ones are a poem called Testimony by Yusef Komunyakaa, which is actually the libretto of an opera on Charlie Parker's life, and then a Joy Harjo poem about Charlie Parker, and then last but not least, Linda Hull's extraordinary poem, Ornithology, about Charlie Parker's life. So you'll hear references to all those poems in this poem.
Wonderful.
Algorithm of the Blues. Tonight, a needle dives into a record's black skin with the drive of a dove winging against the window. And although this ain't the ballad of a wounded bird, one may still pursue in Charlie Parker's tone new ways to stress the moan in testimony. And listen, no matter how high the moon, could Bird ever transcribe any dove's burden with his knowledge of ornithology? Even if childhood hurts or a departed beloved led him to push the pegs of an arpeggio into the hole of his hunger. In some fashion, blue is nothing he ever loved or nothing that ever loved him. Just a frequency of water or sky or bright tones and a bandana tied across his brow. But if some aqua hue fails to fill his lungs, would the blues still attune the ends of his grin to epistemology? Joyce says birdsong proves the futility of words because what human could approve is contrafactual flow. And some nights, even the mood take notes when Bird makes a fractal of a phrase, then flattens and sharpens 1/8 into a swollen vein. This paradox could remain hypodermic, a big flame of bird speak underneath a spoon's black skin, but let's say the song ain't over. Some cats will try to pull from Parker's tone as many parts wit as witness. Others insist the warp and woof of the blues can weave bandanas to flag down the yellow taxis of axioms. Bird lives, they claim, in this address of ghost notes, unexpected as ketchup on cornflakes. So we find ourselves still at the window as he mines a horn's phonographic memory, which cannot choose what it does or doesn't say. Take a phrase, then fracture it, the solo seems to quote, until you feel how some tunes might fray into ontology, might bid one beg a slender hand to twist a band into a bandage.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
Bird lives, they claim.
You know, after that was a common graffiti that was spray painted all over New York City.
Really?
Yeah, and it actually kind of jump-started the idea of urban graffiti in America.
Wow. So that would have been in, like, what time frame was that?
1955.
Okay. Yeah. And that is, that would be Charlie Bird Parker, right?
Yes.
Okay. That's amazing. And so, Joel, let's go back some before we get to the present day of your poetry and your work. Um, how did you begin? And I know that you were raised in Pittsburgh. So, how did Pittsburgh create a poet?
Well, Pittsburgh's created quite a few poets. Actually, the most famous poet from Pittsburgh is August Wilson, who most people know as a playwright, but he
Yes.
insisted always that he was a poet first and a playwright second. Um, Lots of other poets. Some of the famous ones include people like Gertrude Stein and also Jack Gilbert and then Gerald Stern, uh, Lucy Brock Broido, and Terrence Hayes lived in Pittsburgh, and Yona Harvey still lives here. So it's got a we got a decent little tradition going on in Pittsburgh. But I grew up there, born and raised there, and then I went to the
Joel, I can't hear
yes.
you. Okay, thank you.
Okay.
You're back.
Yeah.
All right.
I'm sorry. I was born and raised there, and then I went into the Air Force, and then I moved to D.C. and I wound up living there for about 19 years. So that's actually, where I came of age as a poet was in Washington D.C.
Okay. But what were some of your early inspirations? Oh, you mentioned August Wilson, and so I gather that you knew about Wilson as a child or maybe even a teenager, maybe had read his work or attended a play of his. But what in Pittsburgh, I guess, at the time of your childhood may have inspired you? Or perhaps was it music? Was it jazz or hip hop or some other form?
Well, actually, first of all, I did not know who August Wilson was until much, much later in my life. He wasn't well known in Pittsburgh when I was growing up, although I'm very familiar with many of the places in his plays because a lot of them were actual places. And one of them, in Two Trains Running, Eddie's Restaurant, is a real place. And I actually had a chance to meet both Eddie and his sister Florence. August Wilson worked there, and then he later used it as a setting for a play. And Eddie's Restaurant was a place when I would go back to Pittsburgh where I would always go to meet my dad. And another Pittsburgh poet is Gaston Neal. And with August, August was a teenager. The spot they used to hang out was actually right around the corner from Eddie's Restaurant. But I did a lot of stuff when I was a kid, a lot of creative things. I did origami, I did macrame, I did photography, I played the trumpet, I drew. So poetry was just one of the things that was kind of in there and actually didn't really take a prominent place for me when I was 16. Rappers Delight came out, and so that's the first really really famous rap record. And like a lot of other black teenagers at that time, I started writing rhymes and things of that nature. But it still would be another 10 or 11 years before I sat down and wrote a poem. Although there's two things that stand out for me. One was when I was about 10 years old. They used to have this. They probably still have it, where they put poems on transit. And We Real Cool from Gwendolyn Brooks was on the bus. And I remember coming from somewhere and seeing that poem, and I just sat there and I was reading it over and over and over. I was just completely captivated by it. And the next thing I know, the driver was tapping me on the shoulder, and I looked up, and he was like, "Son, we're at the end of the line. You got to get off the bus." And I was so immersed in the poem that I had, gone past my stop and rode the bus all the way to the end of the line. And then the other thing was a really good friend of mine, Jerry Gaines. His father got killed by their next door neighbor, and I wrote a poem that wound up being published in the funeral program, and that was the first poem that I ever had published.
Mm. Thank you for that, Joel, because I was visualizing you as you did say the trumpet, right?
Right.
Okay, a young trumpet player, and just kind of, it sounds like you definitely had a creative childhood, and I find that is the case for a lot of poets. That's why I like to ask those questions because I'm always interested in, well, what did your life look like as you were, growing up? What were your early inspirations? And so now, after high school, you did go to the U.S. Air Force. Did that experience inform your becoming a poet?
I don't really think so, not in any kind of particular way, except that it was more life experience. I was a mainframe computer operator in the Air Force, but I mean the one constant thing for me was that I always read. Like I stayed in libraries. Even when I was in the Air Force, I'd go to the base library. I was always reading books, about all different kinds of topics. And so I read a decent amount of poetry, but not a great deal of poetry at that point.
Cool. And then, you did mention DC as a place where you really uh, grew into your poetic self and writing poems. And so tell me about that. What can you share what brought you to DC and what was the spark for you with poetry in DC?
Well, I first came to DC because I got stationed here at Andrews Air Force Base in the Air Force. And I was also at that time a DJ. And so when I got kicked out of the Air Force, I worked during the day, as a mainframe computer operator, and then at night as a DJ. And then once I was making enough money spinning records, I quit doing the computer stuff. And so I did that for years. And eventually, what happened, I was working on a club called the East Side in DC, along with a DJ who's since become pretty famous, DJ Cool. And he was working on his first album. And I had written this poem for this young lady, and I had written it on the back of, well, actually, I wrote it like a draft, and then Cool and I would meet every Wednesday, and we would listen to our new records. And so I would make a list to take notes on. So I happened to accidentally grab a draft of the poem and use the backside of it for my list of records. And so I go over to Cool's house and we're talking about our music or whatever, and he happened to pick up my list and he saw there was writing on the other side and he flipped it over and he started reading the poem. And then he was like, yo, I'd like to put this on my album. And so it was a back and forth. And eventually he talked me into it. And it wound up being a ballad on his album called Pressed Against the Glass.
Wow. And so you did mention, Joel, that you were a DJ. And would that be how you got your name, DJ Renegade?
Yeah, that was the last DJ name that I used, and it was the DJ name that I had for the longest time. Actually, I was Jazzy Joel when I first started, and
Mm-hmm.
then I switched to DJ Renegade. I think around '85. I can't
Okay.
agree.
Because that's how I always heard of you. Like before I met you and we became friends on, social media and all that. I always knew DJ Renegade is also a poet. And then finding out, wait, Joel Diaz Porter is DJ Renegade. You know what I mean? So that was kind of
Right.
cool. Just kind of, being a fan of yours from afar and always wondering the story of how you became a DJ and thus how did you become a poet? Because that's really interesting for a poet to also be a DJ, but yet it's not so much unrelated because poetry is connected to music. So, can you talk about how you began to work with your life in poetry and music or being a DJ at the same time?
Well, the poetry thing just kind of happened. I mean, what happened was the song came out and it wasn't a single, but DC had a famous radio format called the Quiet Storm. It later became a big national radio format. But they played that song "Pressed Against the Glass" on the Quiet Storm, and so the other stations played it, and it blew up. And so what happened was I was hanging out in a club with a friend of mine, CJ the DJ, and I left the DJ booth to go to the bar to get some drinks for us, sodas, and I get to the bar, and there's these three women that are having this really heated exchange. And so I'm standing there, I'm waiting on my ginger ale, whatever. And then one of the women turns to me and says, "Excuse me, can you settle a debate for us?" And I say, sure. She said, you know that song on the radio, Pressed Against the Glass? I said, yeah, I know that song. She was like, well, my girlfriend here is saying that the song is about a little boy who wants to buy this bike, but I think it's really like a metaphor for, this woman that he's in love with. She was like, which one of us is right? I said, you are right. It's a metaphor. And so the other woman goes, oh man, forget you. What do you know? And I was like, well, actually, I'm the person,
I'm
I'm
the
the person
person
who wrote it.
who wrote
And
it.
right. And so, the bartender came, when I sold as I went back up to the DJ booth. But I was amazed that people could be like so engaged by, that poem, now a song, like even though Cool recited it, like it's, we would call it phrase didn't exist at that time.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, I was just absolutely stunned. And then everywhere I would go, people would be like, "Oh man, I saw you wrote Press Against the Glass," and I'd be like, "Yeah." And people say, "So you're a poet?" And I'd be like, I guess." And so then so many people kept asking me, if I was a poet. I was like, "Well, if I'm a poet, I guess I better write some more poems." And
Mm.
I started writing and haven't stopped.
So, Joel, thank you for that. And speaking of writing more poems, can you share another poem from your new collection, Ideas of Improvisation, for us?
Sure. Um, since I uh, opened with the Charlie Parker poem, I'll do this poem. So, DuPont Circle is a traffic circle in Washington, D.C. I spend a lot of time there. And, people come there for all types of things, including musicians come there to busk. So there's quite a few things going on in this poem. I'll talk about a few of them very quickly. My book is called Ideas of Improvisation, and it's kind of a riff on a book called Ideas of Order by Wallace Stevens.
Mm.
And so Wallace Stevens' famous poem in that book is a poem called Ideas of Order at Key West. So my poem that's in conversation or in response to his poem is called An Idea of Improvisation in DuPont Circle. And so this is part of my way of, like engaging not just Wallace Stevens, but also, um, Western culture, white America, whatever you want to call it, and on a kind of metaphorical level. So, because for one thing, I don't think that humans' relationship to the world is about order. I think it's about harmony. And as improvisation is based on harmony. And then also, Wallace Stevens, in his worldview, reality and imagination were two diametrically opposed things. Whereas and I think, in Black American culture, we see reality and imagination as opposite ends of a spectrum. And one of the things that connects them is the idea of improvisation. Um, so now, this poem also makes reference to a song called Blackbird by the Beatles. And it also eventually makes another reference to Charlie Parker. And you'll hear, I took the chord progression from the Beatles song and I use it as words in the song, so in the poem. So you'll hear that also. So having said all that, this is an idea of improvisation in DuPont Circle. A blackbird flies from a battered sax at the tonal center of the circle. Its darkness tipping the fountain's waves, rippling flag-like under an April sky, with a rhythm both black and white, though perchance only we can see what is sigil in its rights. Ignore the bystanders assuming the white fountain can't be metaphor, or the soaring blackbird somehow symbol. It's true any blue-black whale over widening water, even raving evermore, might seem bound by simple chords if what spouted from the dreadlocked musician was merely what he'd heard. But weren't these chords also voiced by Bird, whose tarnished horn wasn't spurred by splashing water or rippling wind, but perhaps a sea sharply diminished within? If simply a cerulean sound of the fountain stirred or stilled the green bills in this case, or solely a white silence of clouds extended above, no matter how high, wouldn't it still be the yang of water, only brighter? Why then does he seem to read of a thing more jet than the yen of a blackbird's undulating wings on the wind? Is what his woodwind tries to sculpt more art or artifact? Could any sculpture ringed with purring pigeons be more than just a spouting place where he, God with a minor G, came to create? What chords are these? Which key? An eye nearly elusive as the eye of Stephen's blackbird looks to unravel its complex roots, but finds merely real chords it cannot. And as he blows, this epistle appalls and augments or diminishes any tint of that sky. What becomes artifact in our bicameral minds? Given how a minor seventh singing of starry darkness makes rings of paradox in admiral circles, could these broken wings extend any lift? Meaning, listen, who can say what the sunken eyes of our enslaved ancestors dreamt of darkly thinking overboard of some minor sea? Oh, play, blackbird, riff on if, si vous plaît. These riddle passages were composed of changes you chose, and by choosing, tried to unchain. Contrafact what, as the conductor of dust dons his onyx tuxedo, could swing in the traffic's rhythm, and why we, despite knowing a dominant chord couldn't be conflated with a universal key, might sense in a siren circling above the basin, above even the arc and spume of its spray, a higher harmony. Not quite a call to prayer, but perhaps a small glare in the eye of a rise.
Hmm.
Okay, one
Wow.
other thing is in some of my poems, some of the text is maroon, and so the maroon text forms another poem inside of the longer poem, made up of its words, kind of like an erasure where you can still see the underlying text.
Sure.
And so in this poem, I call those ghost poems. In this poem, the ghost poem is siren circling a higher harmony, call
Mm.
to prayer.
It's beautiful. And Joel, I appreciate um, the imagery in this poem. I mean, words like fountains, waves, rippling flag like, assuming the white fountain can't be metaphor, any blue black whale over widening water. A lot of references to water and just the physicality of that. Fountain stirred, undulating wings, ringed with purring pigeons. Um, there's so much dreamed of darkly thinking overboard of some minor sea, his onyx tuxedo. I mean, you really give just so much color and texture and picture in your poems. Is that something that's conscious for you?
Um, I, it's hard to say. I mean, I did at one point try to make it a point to like learn a bunch of different names for colors. So like I would go to paint stores and look at all the names that they had of colors, and I think I for a little while I was using the color thesaurus, just because I got tired of just saying red, blue, black, green, whatever. But in terms of like when I'm writing, is it conscious? Not really. I do try to incorporate multiple senses in my work. I think there's a lot of, not so much in this poem, but in a lot of my work, there's a very strong sense of touch and taste. But yeah, this poem is mostly more visual for whatever reason, visual and oral.
That's wonderful. And Joel, you've been published in a number of publications, including the very notable Bum Rush the Page, a Deaf Poetry Jam, Catch the Fire, a cross-generational anthology of contemporary African poetry, African American poetry. You featured on the Today Show. You featured in the movie Slam. That's one of my favorites. I used to show it to my high school students. And you're also a Cave Canem Fellow and have really been reading and performing at great lengths over the years. And so I wanted to ask you, what have you learned of your journey to date as not someone who is just published on the page, but someone who is well known on the stage as well?
Well, in our culture, Black culture, there's not a big separation between the page and the stage like there is in standard culture. I mean, Langston Hughes made a CD of him reading his poems with music by Charles Mingus. That was in the 50s. And the beat poets were inspired by black poets like Bob Kaufman, who would regularly perform his poems with, live jazz band. So it's not, for me, there was never any kind of dichotomy between the two. I was a performance poet from the very beginning, and I've also tried to get my poems published from the very beginning. Although I don't say maybe submitting poems as other poets, particularly poets in academia, you have to publish as a way of maintaining their status. I submit far less than a lot of my friends who were in academia. And I've been fortunate over the years to have some poems published in places like the anthology Catch a Fire, for example.
Mm-hmm. True indeed. And it's interesting, although you've shared here, you do not create, a division or distinction, but of course we do know that in the literary community, there are some who make that distinction, and who they're on one track or path or another. Some might even say, pick one. Are you a
Right.
performer or are you a bard or what have you? So, what do you say
Well,
to that?
won the Pulitzer. I
Right.
met time, but at the poetry slam.
Yeah.
He started out in the slam. Patricia Smith, national poetry, four-time national poetry slam champion. She was the Michael Jordan of the poetry slam.
That's right.
So for us, like I said, that distinction, I think is a lot less useful. Yusef Komanyaka has a CD of him performing his poems with the jazz band. Uh, People, Jane Cortez had a band, the Fire Spitters. Amiri Baraka performed with music all the time. Sonia
Oh,
Sanchez,
yes. Mm-hmm.
very much a performance poet. Like, nobody's going to say, there's some kind of distinction for Sonia Sanchez. That would be insane.
No.
Maya Angelou's another poet who, is very famous for the performances of her poems. Nikki Giovanni too. I mean, it's just, that distinction was always something that I never paid much attention to.
I appreciate that. And I agree with you because, as I came into being as a poet or writer and performing in New York City and things like that, it wasn't until until certain, I don't know, I remember when there was clearly a new way when, people were seemingly not as fully embracing the performance poets. And I was going to events and hearing, you need to get an MFA and this is the way to go and this is the thing to do. And so I'm right with you because I'm from the Black arts tradition. I'm one of those poets. Like I look at them as my parents and grandparents. But everyone is not in that tradition, so to speak. So it's nice to hear you say, hey, this is our foundation. This is what we've always done. I agree with you. But I do know that there are some who do not take that history as much of value. And it could be, as you mentioned, due to, academia or what other organizations or schooling they've had, that they did not study, Amiri Baraka and Sonia Sanchez, Nikki Giovanni and the like. So I appreciate that, Joel.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's... Mm-hmm. No, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, so in terms of, I have one more question before I would love to hear another poem. In terms of the pandemic, were you impacted in terms of your creativity? Did it influence you to write a lot more, or did it influence you to dive more into music or change your process in any way?
Not really. I mean, obviously it impacted my life. I gamble for a living. The casinos were shut down, so I was in the house every day. But I'm autistic, so lockdown was wonderful for me. I mean, I know it's a terrible thing to say, but I mean, it's just true. I had to sit in the house and be by myself all the time. And, for an autistic person, that's pretty much nirvana.
Mm.
every day. I ate the same food every day. Everybody had to stay 6 feet away from me. Nobody would just come up to me and randomly talk to me. I could have lived the rest of my life like that.
Right.
It was a burden. I understand it's a burden, for neurotypical people, for people who are highly social, but not for me. So I was sitting in my room watching YouTube videos, reading books every day. I mean,
Wow.
the biggest change for me was uh, listening to. I started watching reaction videos on YouTube. That exposed me to a lot of music that I was not familiar with, including a bunch of singers, people like Diana Ankudinova and Dimash Kudaibergen, who are from different countries.
Mm-hmm.
Jim Adrian, a Turkish singer, just a whole bunch of music from around the world that I probably wouldn't have experienced if not for that. Um, and it was kind of like this because people were sitting at home, so a lot of people started making reaction videos, and I watched a whole bunch of them. So yeah, in terms of it widened my understanding of music, definitely. Of music that gets made all around the world. But I've always been a big music person, um, for I guess a whole bunch of reasons.
Sure. And, do you still do any DJing?
No, I haven't DJ'd since '95. Actually, I gave it up. A couple of reasons, but one of them was at the end in the mid '90s. I was mostly DJing hip hop and R&B, and I was just really unhappy with the direction that lyrics and hip hop were going. It was right when gangster rap was first breaking and coming out, and I just didn't want to play those records. And so I want to start playing some other genre of music. And so that was also the time when uh, poetry was becoming more important to me. So I just kind of, made a shift.
Sure. And that makes sense. Change is good sometimes, and it's, reinventing yourself as well can be really great. Um, and so, Joel, can we get another one of your wonderful poems from your new collection, Ideas of Improvisation?
Sure. Since we've been talking about music and talking about, Pittsburgh and lots of other things, I'm going to share this poem. Um, I grew up in a housing project called St. Clair Village, and the most famous person who grew up in St. Clair Village is an R&B singer by the name of Phyllis Hyman.
Oh,
Phyllis was 12 years
yeah.
older than me, so uh, I didn't know her when I was growing up, but I went to school with her younger brothers and sisters.
Mm,
Okay, so this poem, is a sonnet, it's titled after one of her more famous songs, which is Bet You by Golly Wow. And
mm.
so this poem has a ghost poem inside of it, which I'll read first. But
And
then
can you
also,
tell us, I'm sorry to interrupt, but can you tell us for our listeners what is a ghost poem?
yeah, that's the words in my poems that are in maroon text that form a
Okay.
poem inside of the poem. And then also, this poem has three footnotes, and the footnotes are poems themselves. They're actually haiku. So I'll read the ghost poem, and then I'll read the poem, and then I'll read the three haiku.
Thank you.
Your lips, naked with June rain. Betcha by golly wow for Phyllis Hyman. What blue whale is this, whose child so alone, their tasseled scarf of tightly knit notes trails to caress green hills past dusk? Or quotes lush echoes, bouncing like bald fists off stone faces that flail or float in south side streams, warning throats to beware their half-sip woes, pulling bipolar boxcars in their flow, exiting St. Clair Village under steam. Phyllis, how your lips once puckered with flair, barely brushing our naked neck most nights with lace feathers of whistled melody rippled out of June rain. What splits our air, daring still to dip or flutter? Whose kite, straining at its cord, dying to twist free? June darkness,
Mm.
fireflies pulse into police lights. Last train, her mascara still running. On the shoulder of the pallbearer, a butterfly.
Mm. Wow, that's beautiful. And I'm sure
Thank
Phyllis
you.
Hyman would appreciate that love and emotion from this piece. I know that she was a great singer and gone way too soon.
Yeah, one of my favorite singers, definitely. I just recently noticed that a lot of my favorite female singers are contraltos. Anita Baker, Sade, Phyllis
Mm,
Hyman, Mahalia Jackson, Cassandra Wilson, Liz Wright. It's the tone, the texture,
mm-hmm,
and yeah, Phyllis was, famous for the tone and texture and just her musicality. She was a
mm.
virtuoso whistler, as a matter of fact.
Really? Now,
Yeah, I mean, one.
mhm.
Okay.
Did she have a song called Symphony? I Feel Your Symphony or something like that?
Yeah,
Something. I
she
just feel
did.
like, because I think that would be one of my favorite. I didn't know a lot of her work, but I know that when I hear that song, I just love it and so much. And it just has so much of her, like it's soul stirring, her voice, you know?
Oh yeah, yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
But I'm sorry, but you were saying about the female singers that you really enjoy.
Yeah, actually, you know what? That song that you were referencing is called Moon.
Okay. I didn't know the
It has that
title.
line, "Oh, I
Right.
feel your symphony, so strong and so pure. It echoes on
Mm-hmm.
through me. I'm so sure that we were meant to be here, sharing this love we share."
Oh my gosh, like isn't that beautiful? If someone said that to you, wouldn't you be like, "Oh my gosh, I am yours forever," okay? um, yeah, but I remember those lines. And I'm
Yeah.
probably I'm gonna look her up when after we're done. So thank you for sharing this, Joel. And so my next question is, tell me about your inspiration for ideas of improvisation. Um, this book coming out, on the heels of the pandemic and during a time when we definitely need to be inspired and we need these beautiful words. What was your inspiration for creating this collection?
Well, I can't really say there was, one inspiration. Um, it took me a really long time. Like I got published in 87, 88 the first time. And one or two of these poems in this book, actually, Rap 23, which opens it up, is about that old. I think I wrote that poem maybe 89 or 90. So the book is really probably more like a new and selected. Um, but since it's my first book, then uh, it wouldn't be called that. But yeah, the poems were written over a span of something like 25 years.
Wow.
So I couldn't really say. And actually, the manuscript was put together before lockdown, and then it just got delayed because of lockdown. Um, it took a couple more years for it to come out. So there's a few things. The ghost poems weren't in the original manuscript. That was a thing that I developed during. But for the most part, there's one or two poems I wrote during lockdown, but nothing that I'd say would really, like, thematically impacted by it. Um,
Sure. And that's understandable. Appreciating the fact that you've written this work over such a period of time, it like really shows your commitment to the craft. And that, we don't always have to try to churn something out quickly, that slow marination can be, what turns out such a masterpiece. And, I think could be a real encouragement for emerging poets and people who are thinking about publishing their work who listen to this episode, Joel. And so, Joel, tell me before we wrap with your selection of a last poem. Tell me what is coming up next for you, whether publishing, a talk, or reading, your next podcast, or book signing. And what are you looking forward to as we head into, from fall to winter months?
well, I'm always reading. I'm always writing. I mean, that's what I do. I do those things because I love them. I will be doing here in New Jersey. I'll be headlining the Collingswood Book Festival, which I believe is October 2nd. Um, and then in November, I'll be reading along with the poet Chris Abani, well, poet and fiction writer Chris Abani, for the Folger Shakespeare Library, and that'll be an online event that'll be, accessible to pretty much anybody who's listening that has access to the internet. The Collingswood Book Festival will be in Collingswood, New Jersey, I think October, and that's an in-person event. I don't know uh, if they have any type of online thing going on, but those are the two big readings I have coming on. Other than that, I'm just living my life, doing the things uh, that that I love to do.
Sure. And Joel, how can, our listeners find you, follow you, and purchase your new book, Ideas of Improvisation, published by Thread Makes Blanket?
The book is available. Probably the best place for me for them to get it is directly from the publisher at threadmakesblanket.com. It is, of course, it's available, and on the other online sites that sell books, wherever you get your books from. We don't generally like to send people to Amazon, but it is available there. It's also available in, the online indie bookshops. Um, and I'm on Twitter. My handle there is my last name without the hyphen, so it'd be at DIASPORTER. And I'm on Instagram as at DJ Renegade, and it's spelled DJRENEG, the numeral 8D. And I post poems, and lots of other things. So I'm way more active on Twitter than I am on Instagram. I don't particularly care for Instagram. I'm more of a word person than a text person. And what else? I have a Tumblr that I rarely post to, and I'm on Facebook. Like pretty much everybody else in my generation nowadays.
Well, I
Uh,
love the series of haikus. I love it. The haikus that you tweet out and you put on Facebook. Tell me a little bit about those and what you're intending to do with them.
that is what I'm intending to do with them. I mean, I'm a poet, and one of, one of the forums that I write in is haiku. I love haiku, and I write them all the time. And when I write them, like I said, I'm not as
Joel, I
gifted
can't hear
as.
you as well. Can you
Oh, okay.
lean
I'm
in?
sorry.
Yeah, that's
Is
okay.
that
Go
better?
ahead.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
much
I
better.
don't. My haiku, I'm much more or post them on Facebook or Instagram than I am to submit them for publication. I do sometimes submit them for publication, but I just write them and then I tweet them out into the world, and it's just my way of expressing myself. Um, so yeah, that's just a thing once again that I do because I love to do it.
Well, we all enjoy it, Joel. And, I really appreciate you sharing your work. Please take us out with one last poem from your collection, Ideas of Improvisation.
Okay, this poem is called "The Rumi in You," and it makes a reference to obviously the famous Sufi poet Rumi, and then also to the last poets. And actually, the way that I found Rumi, the Sufi poet, was because one of the members of the last poets had changed his name to Jalal Nuruddin. And I remember going and looking up the name to see what had inspired him. Turns out that that was the name, that was Rumi's name. And so that was how I discovered Rumi. Um, so I'll open with the ghost poem and then I'll read the poem. A diction central to faith, windblown rain. The Rumi in you stirs to wonder. What bruise could love more than the rasp of eroding rain? When you hear rasp, you may think of rust, another type of ruin related to rain. Do you not grasp how Jalaluddin was among the last poets whose nappy beard faced ruin in every nation, including rumination? As one harvest moon acquired a goatee of clouds, didn't you almost admit to whiskering a weak chin as if your own ruined beauty was an unwearable thing? Although you've seldom whispered it, wabi-sabi, rain of ruin, could be a roomy word. When you first heard the flamenco of ruin begin to flower, what did you lament? Could such lonely bruising have begun addiction to the long open you found in wound? Or say why that eye so central to your faith ran quietly as a letter left out in the rain? Perhaps outside some window you misheard the whirling music of windblown petals whispering, "Rain in mystery." But as you once heard a bruise begin to whisk a thickening ruse, could your beard have also masqueraded as faith or masculinity, or perhaps even a beloved which blooms through dark whiskers until there's a chance you hear how some folk become lovers of the sound of rain, but others simply lovers of the sound of ruin?
That's beautiful. And thank you so
Thank
much for showing us the ghost poem and reading that. And just your whole technique is just so enjoyable because, hey, I hear the music in your words, Joel. Like, you've been working with music a long time. But thank you so much for being here with me on Nerdacity Podcast, Joel.
Thank you for having me. It's been wonderful, to come and share my work and, answer questions.
And I wish you the best of success with your new collection, and will certainly continue to follow you and support your work.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I really appreciate it. I really appreciate the opportunity to share my work with you and with your audience.
Thank you again, and take care, Joel.
You too.
And you were just listening to episode 44 of Nerdacity Podcast, hosted by DuEwa Frazier, featuring poet Joel Diaz-Porter. I hope you'll pick up a copy of his new book, Ideas of Improvisation, published by Thread Makes Blanket Press. You can visit threadmakesblanket.com or pick up his book wherever books are sold. You can also visit and follow Joel Diaz-Porter on Twitter and Instagram. I hope you'll follow Nerdacity on Instagram at Nerdacity Podcast. Tweet me about this and other Nerdacity episodes at NerdacityPod1 on Twitter. You can also visit my website, DuEwaFrazier.com, to see what else I have going on. Thanks so much for listening. Take care.